Okay, so in this lesson, we are going to go over systems thinking. This is another really fundamental concept in sustainability. It's become much more prominent recently, but it's a really essential thing to understand for sustainability. Okay, so there was a short reading in the course. And first, what is a system? It's a set of things interacting in a way that produces something greater than the sum of its parts. I think that's actually a really important way to think about it. It's not just like this assortment of things that are interrelated. The idea behind a system is that it's greater than the sum of its parts, like that whole Gestalt concept. And if you think about some of these systems that we'll refer to, some of them are more complex than others, and again, this is identified in the reading. So for example, a car, very complex system, right? A lot of components. I mean, thousands of components in there, a lot of interacting systems. But if you know what you're doing, it's relatively easy to diagnose the problem. Okay. Whereas an even more complex system like a rainforest, again, I mean, this is trillions of components in a rainforest. If something goes awry in a rainforest, it can be very difficult to figure out the source of that problem. So there are different levels of complexity to systems, but again, one of the ideas behind a system is that, for example, with the car, you have all these little, these little mechanical and electrical components. By themselves, they might be pretty cool, but they are not this sort of like magical machine that can, go 100 miles an hour and last for 200,000 miles. But if you put them all together, it's greater than the sum of their parts. Okay. Same with the forest, right? You have an individual tree, an individual bacterium, whatever. They're great and all, but as a whole, they really produce this something that's greater than just adding them up individually. Okay. Other examples, okay, there's innumerable examples of this. Human body, forest, the economy is a system. There's a bunch of components to the economic system. And again, if something goes off, if something's messed up in the system, the economic system, it can be difficult to fix. The earth itself is a system. Everything is related in some way, shape, or form on the planet. You could also think of the earth as a system of systems. Okay, anyway, on to systems thinking. So the traditional way of thinking is this sort of linear model, right? So A causes B, okay? I do want to provide a caveat, and this was in the reading, is that some people call this traditional thinking, although to be fair, there's some traditional societies that thought very systemically. They cite, ancient Greece, India, Native Americans, okay? So this holistic thinking is something that has been utilized historically, okay? But that notwithstanding, we'll consider this traditional thinking or linear thinking or reductive thinking as they call it in the video. So this reductive or traditional thinking is, you have one thing that causes another thing. Whereas systems thinking recognizes that these systems are very complex and that all these components are interrelated. So the idea here is we look at the relationship within the whole system, the relationships within the whole system. Okay, so we look at all the parts of the system rather than just looking at a few, like with this one component and how this other component impacts it. We recognize that systems are complex and we need to look at how the system works as a whole. I'll go over just an example or two here in a minute. Hopefully it'll make it more clear. Really, really important that systems thinking requires considering interconnections and relationships. Okay. It's all about interconnections and relationships. And that nothing should be considered in isolation. And this is really fundamental, is that when we solve problems, we consider the sources, not just the symptoms. So what is actually causing this symptom? Not just put a Band-Aid, the proverbial Band-Aid on it, but think about what is actually causing this. So that's systems thinking requires that you really think deeply about what's causing this issue and how we can correct it based on how that thing is impacted by all the components of the system. And not only that, but what the impacts down the road will be from changing anything in the system. Okay, so they give a couple examples in the reading of the difference between the two. So traditional thinking or reductive thinking is humans are separate from nature. We can do whatever we want. We just use nature as a place to dump our waste and pull our resources, which is basically how the economy treats it. Whereas systems thinking is, okay, we recognize that we're part of nature, we depend on nature for survival, that we're actually part of this system, that we're not just able to pull out of it and dump into it. So that's one example of how you can use the systems thinking approach to address any kind of human environment interaction. They give the example of terrorism. So the idea that if we want to combat terrorism, that we can just kill terrorists, while that may certainly be part of the remedy, you have to look at what are the actions. If you want to get rid of terrorism, period, you need to look at what's causing it. And while, of course, killing terrorists may be part of the solution, if we want to stop it, you need to look at what's causing it. Generally speaking, poverty is one of the most important reasons that terrorism occurs. Repressive governments, our military intervention, historical and contemporary. There are a lot of examples of this where we solve one terrorism problem. You look at, for example, what happened when we were helping train Afghans to fight the Soviets back in the 80s, and then some of them turn that training and to use it into terrorism. So there are a lot of examples of this, that there are these sort of complex causes for why we have terrorism, and it's never going to stop if we just keep killing terrorists. So from a systems perspective, we need to look at what's causing it and address that. If we're looking at poverty as a major issue, which pretty much everybody recognizes as a major issue, and you say, well, it just means people are poor because they're lazy. Well, of course, that's part of this problem. But I know some wealthy, lazy people. I'm sure everyone that's listening to this knows some people that have money that aren't particularly industrious. But we have to look at what the causes of poverty. And there's a ton of research out there that's showing that it depends highly on what family you're born into, what race, gender, culture you're born into, what country you're born into, what neighborhood. There's all kinds of research on zip code. If you look up zip code mortality rates, just the zip code that you're born into says a lot about your chances for sort of quote unquote making it, or at least getting out of poverty. So there's a lot of complex sources to poverty. I'm not here to tell you I know the solution, but it's absolutely the case that it's not just due to laziness, that there are a lot of other issues involved. So from a systems thinking perspective, if we want to solve the poverty problem, we have to look at what's actually causing it. All right, so let's look at an example that that was in the first presentation. So the Brazilian forest fires, this was a really big issue in the summer of 2019. And so if you look at from a linear or traditional approach, if we want to solve this problem, probably the easiest thing to do is put out the fires, or the most straightforward thing. Put out the fires, right? Okay, problem solved. Well, of course, if you really want to solve this problem, this happens every single year, you have to look at what's actually causing it. So some of the reasons here, the global beef industry is a really big one. A lot of these fires are set by farmers that are raising cattle. Soybeans, a little bit to some extent. We have to look at the government in Brazil. So the president that was elected in 2019 effectively promoted clearing of the rainforest to promote other economic activities. So the point is, if you want to solve this, you need to use a systems-based approach and think about what's really causing these fires, and not just putting them out, but let's prevent them to the extent possible from starting again. And if you look at income inequality, another issue that we looked at in the first week. So a traditional solution, I don't know if you want to pause and think about that, maybe just tax the rich. Again, while this may be part of the solution, if you just increase taxes, but you don't address the underlying issue, the underlying aspects of the economic, social, political system that's causing inequality, it may be a temporary band-aid, and then it's just going to happen again. And that's kind of actually what's happened. If you look at the chart and you look at the history, we did have these, times where we had a lot of inequality, and then it kind of leveled off, and then it's getting bigger again. So from a systems approach, you don't want to just raise taxes on the wealthy. That's probably not going to solve the problem. It's certainly, almost certainly, part of the solution. But you really need to look at how this system, maybe the relationship between corporate America and politics and the politicians, maybe the lack of the will of politicians to go after these sort of tax cheaters and people that are offshoring their money and so forth. Okay, so the point is, if you really want to solve this problem, you need to use a systems-based approach. Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening. Okay, and so that's our systems thinking lesson. It's really, really important. I want to stress this. It's really important to understand that when we're addressing sustainability, we need to use a systems-based approach. Look at the interconnections. We need to look at the sources of the problems and never consider anything in isolation.